Introduce as well. I don't know if some of you may have met Sukant before. He's been here running a few of the controversial conversations. He's not only here as George's driver, and thanks so much for bringing George from London today, Sukant, but he's also experienced and wise political activist in his own right for many years now. George, I think we first met around the time of the land reform in Zimbabwe.
Oh, right. Okay.
Obviously, which was very much sort of in Zimbabwe when they finally began to sort of redistribute some of the land around about 96, was it? Around that sort of time? Which you know, in many ways the whole liberation struggle could be seen as a struggle for the land. I'm sure George will kind of address some of these issues. And it was very much demonized, the land reform project in Zimbabwe, when it began in 96 in this country, for kind of obvious reasons in terms of who was losing out, you know, British landowners and so on. And George was one of very few voices putting a different perspective across in the media. But yeah, long history as a scholar activist, and before that as a liberation fighter in the Southern African resistance movement, specifically Zimbabwe. So, yeah, welcome, George.
Thank you. Really, thank you deeply. I miss moments like this because think of it as somebody who's tuning their instrument before they play in a jazz session. So if you miss the joke, don't worry. Maybe I'm trying to find out if my saxophone is in key before I say something of use, if anything.
He actually plays the saxophone.
I always wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to be a teacher because I thought it's like performance, like on stage. But at the same time, I wanted to buy my mother a bicycle. Like a current skate, and buy my mother a scooter. Bicycle. In that kind of very colonial time in which having a bicycle was a very big thing, never mind for your mother. I never succeeded in doing that, but that was the hook. So every time I return to a notion, a place which involves teaching, I've spent most of my teaching life with teaching people slightly older than you. It always reminds me of that moment of being on stage, like I'm on Broadway. And what happens is if you follow my hands, if you can't get a grip of what I'm going on, because I tend to think not in a kind of narrative way. I sort of think simultaneously, like a jazz piece as it emerges. So one hand is usually the page or the paragraph, and the other one is following. So if you lose the one that's sort of like, sometimes I get quite adjectival. Just hang on with the substantive. Or sometimes I might stop. So if you lose it, just follow the hands. The performance is part of the story. And I guess I'm trying to say something also about voice. I mean, the thing about voice is not just, is much more complex than we give it. And for me, the voice that was absent was in many ways my mother's voice in what I was learning. Or my grandparents' voice in the life I was living, or the voice of the things that I experienced every day in the place I was born and I grew up. And I developed a sort of visceral, which I still have, reaction to injustice. And I think of myself as off the left, or revolutionary, or whatever it might be, because it's really, that's what drives me, that would drive me. So I thought, well, okay, how might I do that? I found myself increasingly being able to do that around the site of teaching and learning. So I became kind of fascinated with injustices that are produced by the making and production of knowledges, whatever they are. Right? I mean, I wasn't as written out as that. I didn't write it in the back of an envelope, but when I grow up, I'm going to become this. I sort of fell into place. But if I were to think of something that has been there all the time, it's that visceral hatred of injustice. Okay. I think the thing about voice is the only way in which I could do that with you is to do that by way of something that is close to, or a footnote in my biography, or footnotes in my biography, through the lives that I've lived. Not as the gospel according to St. Mark, but it's just sort of snippets of things that I've seen around the corner and so on. And I hope in a reflection and conversation with you, you might ask me questions about whether or not that makes sense or not. That's by way of suggesting what I might talk about. The questions that arise from an intergenerational conversation, rooted in a history of anti-imperialism, liberation struggle, fugitive discourses, questions of learning, questions of living together, and imagining what the world we live in is. I mean, when I was your age, there wasn't a single place I could have gone to, or was there? There wasn't a place where there could be a module that talked about inequalities without being arrested. Okay? The Southern Africa that I lived in when I was your age, the very existence of this group would have been illegal, right? Your tutor here would have been sentenced to 30 years for organizing this session. Now, it's important to think of apartheid in that way, that the friendships you have in this room would have been illegal, right? And even if you did have those clandestine relationships, if you had any children of those relationships, they could not be legally registered as fellow human beings. That's how I'm trying to crystallize in your image what apartheid society was like, okay, in the everyday. It just is so vile that it's almost it's beyond representation sometimes. But that's the best image I can give you. It's not the case that there wasn't an educated class. There was an educated classes of people who were only, you could have as many degrees as you like, but the only job that was designed for you was marked racially. So you'd find a whole range of garden boys or gardeners or nannies and so on with postgraduate qualifications, but the only jobs that they can do are a caretaker or a bouncer. What I sometimes call the South Africanization of the world is very much like that. So if you see the Economic Freedom Foundation, the EFF part in South Africa, when you look at one of the reasons they wear of those red overalls is a reminder of that. I'm not suggesting that's where you should go. I'm just trying to make you visually think about the story of apartheid. It's not a finished story, but rather amoeba-like, still very much present in the story of South Africa. So this conversation in itself would have been illegal. And even to be known to have come to a class like this was bound to get you into very, very serious trouble. And a lot of people went into exile, okay? Because they'd done other than, not just because they had a white girlfriend or a black girlfriend or an Asian girlfriend. So a lot of people lost their lives because they had an interracial relationship. Nothing to do with the ideological standpoints that I or you or anybody else might have. That was raw South Africa's everyday. And that in many ways is what immediately ignited people to be against it gradually. It was also a system inscribed in law. South Africa went around the world picking up examples of how you can do racism proper. Went to the Netherlands, came to the United States, came to Britain, picked up all the top bits and mixed them together and produced the apartheid state, right? So apartheid wasn't born in Durban, okay? It begins here and then is finessed there. It's a child of the center. It's not a product of a kind of renegade, periphery. This is the incubator. Think of it as being born here and then exported elsewhere. Just like neoliberalism is. This is the fountainhead of it and exported elsewhere. Like I said earlier, the bodies of prisoners being exported to Australia. It does that. It's disturbing reality. That is its disturbing point of origin. I'm in my 70s. It's been a long time. When I was, I grew up as my childhood in the 50s. I'm really of the 50s and 60s, really. I grew up, I went through international, I was culturally connected to the 60s, 1968, all that, flower power, hippies and the rest of it. Music connected me to the international. I used to walk around with a bandana thinking I was Jimi Hendrix reincarnate. I mean, I just knew everything about Woodstock. You'd think I was born next door. I was connected to the counterculture internationally in that way. Now, I'm raising that because it was also an aesthetic in itself of a certain metropolitan kind of students in a number of tertiary institutions across the country run by missionaries and so on, but not necessarily at the university, because to get to the one single university, you would already been a goody shoes person who's unlikely to know anything about Otis Waywood. I mean, they just didn't hang out. Do you know what I mean? And so the student movement of my time was not at the University of Rhodesia. It was nevertheless in the high schools and the boarding schools and so on. The ones that couldn't get into this single institution, right? They were already like the equivalent of access students. They were the equivalent of perhaps the academy school. I don't know much about this school, compared to the other post schools that you might find in this city. They had a different brand to them. They were connected to the world. This is also a very Protestant world in which the idea of the Rolling Stones was considered a sin. White Rhoddies and white South Africans were so square you could choke. Okay, so one way of irritating them was to say, I'm a rock star. I mean, they would just go bananas. So we would play, I mean, I would play Jethro Tull like I was incarnate, just to offend them, just like. I mean, I suppose it was the equivalent of punk to us. We didn't, so it wasn't, it just had this sort of meaning to it. Because in Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, because Ian Smith had declared UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, from Britain, anything associated with Britain to the Rhodesians was considered oppositional. What way of showing that you are anti-Rhodesian without getting arrested, other than wearing a T-shirt that says the Rolling Stones? Do you know what I mean? So that sense of being connected to internationally through the site of popular culture was key to my generation. So you can hear Machine Gun. I don't remember if you listen to Jimi Hendrix. Sorry if I'm so old-fashioned. But he's playing around with Vietnam. He reminded me as I was talking to
Black band.
He was talking about Vietnam. And Jimi Hendrix playing Machine Gun. And it's of course it's got the backdrop of the anti-Vietnam War. And so we gave ourselves names of that band as pseudonyms in the war. Right? So if you look at some of my generation, their involvement in the liberation struggles, the names, identities we took, were figures that so I got to listen to Curtis Mayfield from a radio station which was called Radio Lorenzo Marx, which was in Maputo. You have to remember the Portuguese were in crisis too. This is before 1974. And the radio is a very interesting thing because it's the only place in which we could listen to what is happening to the world in as much as counterculture is concerned. So oppositional politics, fugitive politics, is a trace to consider, to think about. Okay? But those forms of organized studies in which you might do popular culture or equalities didn't exist. You have actually now an opportunities in which you can explore how we might live together on the planet through forms of studying popular culture or a course in a module like this one. So I'm trying to mark the difference between then and now in that remark. The first thing that, when I was about 15, 16, there was a wave of student demonstrations, uprisings, and so on. And as a kind of like wayward teenager of my time, the only thing to do was be involved in insurgencies. That was the coolest thing to do. You know, I mean, I didn't go to a workshop or discover, that didn't happen to me that way. It was just kind of cool thing to do. Okay? You join everything else. So we became involved in sort of sabotaging this. I was telling Sukan earlier on the kind of cultural difference around pets and so on. First thing that occurred when I came to this country, people said to me, "Do you like dogs?" And I was telling a story about the kind of involvement I was involved in. And you had this kind of, in the colonial days, they would have sort of like the police who were the kind of ones who were very much on a day battles with young people on the street would have batons, guns, and these horrifying, terrifying dogs. So me and my mates used to go around, sort of find some raw meat, put some local, from some wild fruit, some poison into the raw meat, and distribute it into this dog kennels owned by the police and the army. And over a day or two, the entire population of dogs in a particular area were found dead the following day. Which kind of, and I thought that was a cool thing to do, right? So fast forward, people say, they're talking to me about, well, what did you do in that struggle? So I tell them that story, right? And so the silence, like I'd done, seemed so terrible. I hadn't realized that in this country, if someone says to you, "Do you like pets?" you say yes. You don't tell them that you used to bloody kill dogs. Okay? You just don't do things like that. But I didn't go out of the country, train in a guerrilla, and then come back and do. That came later. In fact, that was on the way out. I began in those kinds of, young insurgency activities of simply being against in an injustice that I saw around me. Okay? And that's the connection between my upbringing, my biography, becoming involved in the liberation struggle, and the kind of scholarship that I sort of tried to pursue here and there. Back to your module. 3 things that came to me when the listener, 4 things that came to me, although I make some remarks on it. I don't subscribe to the idea of the ANC won. I know that sounds really negative. I don't. And I'll explain why. I think the ANC project was hijacked very much, if it had one, very much at the beginning of the moment a consideration to release Nelson Mandela begins. Okay? Because for the most part, the person who carried the name of the ANC was Oliver Tambo. If you really want to understand the ANC, literally at its most crucial, critical moment it could have made some inroads into the issues that we're describing now, go to understand a figure like Oliver Tambo. His biography is very useful to have a look at. The second thing to do is to understand the impact of the Cold War, yes, on one hand, the demise of the Portuguese, Salazar, 1934, and the Sino-Soviet conflict on another. as they impacted on the mood of independence mood that was, from the north to the south. Algeria put aside for a moment, but the independence mood that was blowing through the continent after the Second World War. The ANC, after 27 years, the last 27 of its years of life, just before the release of Nelson Mandela, held it together largely because of Oliver Tambo. Mandela, respectable, wonderful dance machine, beautiful shirts everybody would make of him, is not my father. Okay? I don't mean disparagingly. I think he became, something else happened. It was towards the tail end of his life. And I don't think of him as the best student of Robben Island. But yes, there was a question about apartheid in the question I just described. But I don't think that his analysis or understanding, at least in as much as the stuff that he himself says, in my understanding of Southern Africa, I don't think of myself as somebody whose life is very much connected to the region rather than one place, is one that looked at the material conditions that produce that very legal state. There were some people who were, people like Chris Hani, okay, who was assassinated just before 1994. I sometimes wonder who inherited the mantle of Chris Hani. How come South Africa today has become one of the carriers, the most draconian immigration laws on the continent? How do we explain the rise of xenophobia, racism in South Africa? Is it really a myth, and I think it's a myth, that South Africa ever did have a stable economic foundation of any kind? What on earth makes people think that Lagos, with its yachts and God knows what, somehow visually is worse off than Joburg? I mean, Joburg is comparable to Sao Paulo, if anything, on the planet. It is as miserable as hell architecturally in that regard. But how did it occupy this image in our consciousness to think it is the most, whatever it is, place of... My generation did think it could become an example in building a post-racial place of which we could all love and enjoy. Everyone of my generation subscribed to that. What went wrong? Part of it is to do with the absence of the material conditions of which a racial story could be built or could sustain. So the arrangements, whether it's about the economic, whether it's... This is the place where everybody wanted to give the economic a free rein. Then if only you could have George Shire as the bank, the head of the Bank of South Africa, it'd be okay. If only, I mean, that would have been the worst possible thing on the planet. But that's precisely how most people think. Nobody imagined, in retrospect, I never imagined that the Tory party in this country would have on its front bench, okay, bodies that are the reincarnate of the soul of inner power. I never imagined that I would live through a time there would be a Suella Braverman. It's impossible to, because at some point I thought one could just wire chromatically an identity to a politics. Today, I don't, and I want to invite you to give up that story, important as it might be sometimes, right? And I don't think in the quarrel in struggle in South Africa, anti-apartheid story, we anticipated that you could have these black folk and a whole room, people full of black folk, being the producers and circulators of the most miseries of black, equally indigenous people, and are producing a discourse discursively that describes fellow Africans as foreigners. Okay? I never imagined that. So that didn't come as it is to do with the absence of connecting things to the material conditions as they exist, not as I would like them to be. Now, of course, some people would have said maybe socialism might have done the trick, or the Communist Party might have been. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm still trying to search for my intellectual ancestors that might, one person might give me one insight there, that's why it matters a great deal to us to think together with a vested interest of what I call a planetary politics. I'm not just sort of like the planet in that sense. I love very much, but sometimes our squeeze is slightly different. I'm trying to think what I call a planetary politics, away from the notion as an opposition to a world politics. A planetary politics, because I know that every single neoliberal capitalist project imaginable has been tried on the African continent, right? And I like to argue that this century, the African continent will become the major event. The precariousness of the African continent will become the major event of this century. It's where I think the solution on environment, the economic, the way we live together, architecture, God knows what, is likely to be imagined and lived.